Hello everyone. This class is going to be about how to read the mystics for depth and transformation. It's a long title, but it's an important subject. Most of us are influenced by other mystics, and we usually come across their work in books. You'll find podcasts about them, or people will read them, quote them in seminars or on Facebook. But if we're interested, we'll go and we'll find a book or an excerpt about them that gives us more information. And when I spent time on the spiritual path, really what inspired me most were books of other saints and seers and visionaries who I would take with me on my journeys. I'd read them on retreats. I'd read them in train stations going from retreat center to retreat center or pilgrimage site to pilgrimage site, and become intimate with them. And these mystics became my friends through their printed word. It's something that we're not taught how to engage with in a way that's going to be most transformative. So people will pass you a book, but they won't pass on to you necessarily the way to engage with the writings in the book so that you can discover a living relationship with the nuggets of the mystics. So how do we develop a living relationship with printed matter, which may have been written 500 years ago, 2,500 years ago? How do we work with the insights of the mystics in a way that's really going to take us somewhere, enlarge our inner space, and really give us the capacity to change our views and to be able to take different views and perspectives and entryways into the sacred that won't be familiar to us. And maybe they're not ones that we want to adopt or incorporate into our lives. But these are going to be entry points into the sacred that will stretch us from the inside out. And that's very important because we don't know what we don't know. It sounds obvious, but we really don't know what we don't know. And we think we leave room for what we don't know. But we tend to approach things the way we've been acculturated to, through the path or the perspective or the avenue that's most comfortable for us, and through the lens that we've either grown up with or adopted. So learning how to work with the thoughts of the mystics and the views of the mystics and different mystics in a way that really tests us and opens us up will enrich and fertilize our own spiritual path. We're not talking about a la carte mysticism. We're not talking about taking a small piece from each of these different sources and trying to put it all together. We're talking about doing what Huston Smith, the grandfather of the study of different religions in our times. We're talking about what Huston Smith did in his own life. He had his own deep practice. When he wrote about another tradition, he immersed himself in it in a way that enabled him to understand it, understand where it was coming from, the culture it was arising from, and then write about it with a depth and a reverence for that mystical approach on its own terms. So this is what we're going to do in the class today. And the first big idea about that is to read for depth and not for quantity. This is not, when we're reading the mystics, we're not doing our PhD on comparative religion. We're not getting our Masters of Divinity from Harvard. What we're doing is we're reading for depth and we're reading for transformation. So the way we want to approach this work is we want to approach the work with a sense of reverence and a sense that less is more. So that we want to stop, we want to pull ourselves back before we're satiated. Because we don't want to flip page after page after page of Rumi and become desensitized to the heart and the subtlety and the delicacy that Rumi is conveying through his work. And it's the same with more complex thinkers like Teilhard de Chardin, he's very dense, he's very complex, and he's also translated from French, which makes it even more complex for us. So trying to make your way through an entire volume generally will defeat the purpose of real transformative learning. So you want to immerse yourself in it in a way that you're not just trying to define word by word by word, but to immerse yourself in a way that you can feel the mysticism coming through the words. And you want to pay attention to the times when something is challenging you or when something inspires you. So oftentimes we'll stop if we feel something, we feel bliss. So we'll stop because we want to enjoy that feeling. And if we feel frustrated or that we don't like something, we tend to want to move faster and just run by it. Sometimes when we're reading the mystics and we feel that sense of discomfort, the sense of discomfort's a positive one. It means that something about our fixed ideas is being challenged. Something about the way that we're accustomed to seeing the world is being pushed against. Now, we may not in the end agree with the approach of the mystics or the conclusions of that particular mystic, but we want to stop at those points and open up to them, kind of figure out, well, what is it about them? What is it about what they're saying? What does this show me about my own approach, my own fixed ideas? And where were they really coming from? What is it about this that I have such a strong reaction to? Now, it can be the culture of the times, that you don't like the culture of the times, that we've developed, we have a deeper sense of gender equality or autonomy or some of the other postmodern characteristics that we have. But so particularly when we read some of the great Christian mystics or the Greek Philokalia, where they talk a lot about surrender and they talk a lot about penance, or in Hinduism they talk about tapas, we don't tend to approach our spiritual path that way. So it can feel outdated, it can feel self-negating, it can feel harsh, it can feel punitive. But there's a reason why they practice those things. And so if we leave aside our cultural objections and enter into the mind and the ethos of the Greek Orthodox Christians who were writing about the need for self-purification, who were writing about the need for renunciation, who were writing about the need to push one's limits in order to realize God, will appreciate from their view that they're aspiring to a level and depth of transformation that we might not have even considered. And just opening ourselves up to consider that possibility starts to plant those seeds in us. Whether or not we're going to end up going to Mount Athos in Greece and practice some of those austerities, because they were pretty tough. I mean, they slept on beds of nails, and they went without sleep for days and days and days, and all kinds of extremities. I'm not necessarily advocating that, but some people may be called to do that. But understanding that there's a spiritual call that compels individuals to want to go so far beyond their comfort zone, because they realize that there's a level of heart and oneness and compassion and grandness of our human nature that they want to embody in their lives, and they're willing to push themselves in order to realize that. Just considering that creates depth in us. It makes us think beyond the limitations of our culture. It makes us think beyond just getting a little bit better, just getting our mindfulness in, just getting a little less stressed, just getting a few more friends, just getting a little bit more comfortable. Those things aren't bad, but we want to hold them in a context that elevates the possibility of profound transformation. we want to put time into grasping and understanding also the cultural context, the milieu of these mystics. And I thought I'd give you an example from Jiddu Krishnamurti. J. Krishnamurti, or sometimes he was just called J.K., sometimes he was just called K, was a powerful and beautiful human being, and really the teacher of the pathless land. He spoke about understanding thought, understanding the mind. He was born in the late 1800s and died in 1986. And I'm going to read you a quote of his, and then I'm going to lay out a little bit about the time that he lived through and why this quote is also why he was thinking this way when he was looking for how to transform ourselves deeply in order to transform culture. This quote is from Freedom from the Known, which is one of his well-known books. So Krishnamurti says, "Is there a problem of violence out there or here? Do you want to solve the problem in the outside world, or are you questioning violence itself as it is in you? If you're free of violence in yourself, the question arises, how am I to live in a world full of violence, acquisitiveness, greed, envy, brutality? Will I not be destroyed?" That's an inevitable question which is invariably asked. When you ask such a question, it seems to me that you're not actually living peacefully. If you live peacefully, you will have no problem at all. You may be imprisoned because you refuse to join the army, or shot at because you refuse to fight. But that is not a problem. You will be shot. It's extraordinarily important to understand this. So that's a challenging quote. And it's an easy quote to disagree with. And it's an easy quote to have questions about. So I'm not going to go into those. And I appreciate them. Well, a couple of things to think about in terms of Krishnamurti's life, because he was born in India. He was cognizant of World War I. He was old enough to understand the horrors of World War I. Then he lived through World War II as an adult. He lived through the partition of India and Pakistan, where 1 million people were brutally slaughtered on the border. So that's part of the background and the cultural context of his time. So as he was thinking about violence and the violent nature of the way we divide us and them, the way we as human beings look for power and security, and the grand international global landscape that this plays out on, this was all informing his deeper questioning. So if we're going to solve the problem of violence fundamentally, he felt we had to go beyond a kind of divisiveness of thought that was so radical in nature that once we were able to do that in our own minds, we would relate to the world in a very different way. So you can see it's very deep and it's very profound. And to go to the place that he's pointing to would take all of us to go beyond just a simple questioning, is that right, is that wrong, would that work in Gaza, would that work in Missouri, would that work, with ISIS, would that work in any of the other crisis centers in the world. He's asking for an engagement at the level of thought and identification with thought and identification with self, that if we go there, our whole being will be transformed. And from there, we'll engage with the world from a very different place. And if we don't go that far, we won't get to where he's pointing to. So this is how we engage with the mystics. When we read the mystics, we want to take them all the way to the end. We want to allow what they're talking about to let ourselves go there and suspend our judgment, suspend our critical mind. Not because it's not useful, but we have to let go of a certain quality of critical mind that's going to bounce what they're saying off what we already know, and bounce what they're saying off the limitations that we've already assumed are fixed, because they're intuiting something about the nature of the self, about the nature of God, about the nature of the religious life, and about the capacities of humanity. So if we go there with them, to that end, to that extreme, we'll get a sense of what they're pointing to. And then a lot of our practical objections won't feel the same way. I mean, we may need to respond. We may need to take action. We may want to express our views and opinions on certain civil rights issues, political rights issues, human rights issues. That's not the point. But the point is what in this case Kay was pointing to was a relationship to thought that he felt was beyond the violence that he saw all thought as being because of its divisive nature. So this is how we engage with the mystics in a way that transforms ourselves. Now the other thing that we want to look at, the cultural context, and you can see that in this example, his life story. Another example is the personal life story and trajectory of the mystic. So what was it that made them the person that they are? How did they get there? Where did they come from? What happened in their life that inspired them? So the classic example is the Buddha. Of course, you know, he was born into luxury and riches. He was a prince. He was protected from ever seeing illness and suffering and death. He, you know, everything, you know, he never experienced temperature discomfort, because if it was warm, they brought fans, and if it was cool, they brought heat. Everyone around him had to be incredibly beautiful who served him. He never saw anything unattractive. He never saw decay. He never had food that was not perfectly prepared. So he was shielded from life. And what set him on his quest was he, you know, was out of the palace, and he happened to see old age and sickness and death around him, and that led him to think very deeply about life, and it led him to think that he was also going to suffer from that. He could be protected from it, but he couldn't avoid that as a person. And the other thing about him was that he started to question on his own, and he went and he observed different teachers. And I will read you a passage from him, which I think is really telling. Is from a translation of the Life of the Buddha by, and I think he's an English monk, Bhikkhu Nanamoli. And it's a beautiful passage, and it's a way of reading his life story that's a little bit more engaging. Some of the language is very close to the Pali translations. Pali is the language of Theravadan Buddhists. So you'll have to just skip over some of that translation. But what we're going to see in this passage is we're going to see that his powers of observation led him to come up with a teaching where he promoted the power of observation, of seeing for oneself, of not taking anything for granted. That's what he did. That's what he taught. So he said, I went forth from the house life into homelessness to seek what is good, seeking the supreme state of sublime peace. Therefore I went to Acharya Kalama, and I said to him, Friend Kalama, I want to lead the holy life in this Dhamma and discipline. When this was said, Acharya Kalama told me, The Venerable One may stay here. This teaching is such that in no long time a wise man can enter upon and dwell in it, himself realizing through direct knowledge what his own teacher knows. The Buddha said, I soon learned the teaching. I claimed that as far as mere lip reciting and rehearsal of his teaching went, I could speak with knowledge and assurance, and that I knew and saw there were others who did likewise. Then I thought, it's not through mere faith alone that Acharya Kalama declares his teaching. It's because he's entered upon and dwelt in it, himself realizing it through direct knowledge. It's certain that he dwells in this teaching, knowing and seeing. Then I went to Acharya Kalama and I said to him, Friend Kalama, how far do you declare to have entered upon this teaching, yourself realizing it through direct knowledge? When this was said, he declared the base consisting of nothingness. It occurred to me then, it's not only Acharya Kalama that has faith, energy, mindfulness, concentration, and understanding, but I too have these faculties. Suppose I strove to realize the teaching that he declares, to enter upon and dwell in, himself realizing it through direct knowledge. Then I soon succeeded. So of course the Buddha was, he was kind of an upstart, because at the time you were really supposed to take the teacher's word as it is, and you were supposed to take it on its own terms and learn and study and be able to recite. But the Buddha, he looked at the teacher and he said, well, he can discern, he can see, he can practice. I have those capacities. I'm a human being like him, so I can do that too. So that's what he did. So the Buddhist teaching, which has become very popular in the West, is partly popular because it says through discrimination, through the use of your mind, through observation, through experimentation, you can directly apprehend the true nature of all things. So understanding his life, understanding what led him out of the life that he was in, gives you an understanding of the foundations of his teaching, and it humanizes him. It makes him not this mythical deity who flew down from one of the higher heaven realms, having perfected the art of compassion over countless lifetimes, which he may or may not have done. I really don't know about those things. But what we can take is we can see through his own personal life story that his teaching is a reflection of what worked for him. And it's a reflection of what didn't work and that which he rejected. So as we read the mystics, as we learn about their lives, and as we take them into our being, because we become intimate through them, not just by knowing them, but by feeling them in us, by taking their words and their heart and their attitude and their dress and their country and absorbing it, so that we feel like they're with us. We know them from the inside out, and then we can understand better what they were pointing to, and unexpected things come from left field, and you say, oh, that's what Buddhism means by dependent origination. No, I'm not just a prince living in a castle, independent of everything around me. I am dependent on so many things for life and the cycle of life. And all these things start to make sense. They become less injunctions to live by, or, tractates to memorize, but they become observations. They become observations that somebody had and who radically transformed themselves and really became a light unto the world through their transformation and their powers of observation and discernment. And that inspires us to look at life with that kind of engagement, with that kind of intensity, with that kind of questioning, with that kind of heart, so that we in our own 21st century urban lives also start to come up with our own direct apprehension and relationship with the mystical nature of life and with our higher human capacities, so that we start becoming lights in our own circles. And that's really why we read the mystics and what they're for. The challenge of taking mystics on their own terms is a big one. And I'm going to give you another example from the 15th century poet Mirabai. I happen to pull 3 examples from India. We certainly do this, and I approach the visionaries and philosophers and mystics from the West, from America, from Europe, the same way. So I just realized that I happen to pull 3 from Mother India, but it's definitely holds true for others. It's very challenging to sometimes read mystics and not reject them because of things that we feel very strongly about in culture. And Mirabai is one example. So if you believe in gender equality, and if you believe in the need for women to have a strong voice, and if you believe in the need for a kind of autonomy of expression rather than surrender, Mirabai is going to just rub you the wrong way. So I had a lot of trouble with Mirabai, which is partly why I want to read one of her words. I first heard one of her poems, a beautiful lecturer read one of her poems in a conference I was speaking at, and I don't remember a word of the poem. I can't remember which one it is. I almost feel like it was some mystical poem that didn't really exist, but it touched me. Something about it touched me incredibly deeply. So a couple months later, I got one of Mirabai's books, and I started reading her. She's the most famous of all Indian mystical female poets, and I couldn't stand her work. It drove me crazy. Everything about it bothered me for a lot of different reasons, which were all pretty good. So I kept reading, and I kept reading, and I kept reading, and after I read about 50 or 60 of her poems, something just exploded inside. And this kind of spiritual, mystical openings started to take place. And then I experienced a type of current that she was really speaking from. Now, my mind still doesn't like a lot of the things that she's saying, but where she's speaking from and the abandon and devotion are extraordinary. And I'm going to read you one of her poems so you get a sense of that. Before I do that, one thing about her life, which is extraordinary, is she was, she wasn't a high class caste woman. She married above herself, and at a certain point, her mystical realization was all she cared about. Her husband tragically died in a battle, and she decided to pursue her love of Krishna rather than do the dutiful things that a dutiful wife is supposed to do, and thereby keep her inheritance and keep her new social status. So she threw all of that to the wind for the sake of her own spiritual realization. She didn't care. So although she comes across as one who advocates surrender in her own life, she was actually unbelievably brave and independent, and in that sense, for a 15th century woman in India, an incredible role model for women who buck the system and challenge spiritual authorities and insist on their own spiritual realization having validity and credibility and being equal to the great sages of the time, which she did. So she was really quite a wild character, but you can see the complexity. So I'm going to read one of her poems now. This beautiful volume is translated by Robert Bly, so he's done a great job updating them. This one's called "To Dance for the Dark One is All the Clothing Mira Needs." I'm dancing only for my master. All I want is to please him and keep his eyes. The gold chains I wear on my ankles are love of Sham. My dancing dress is my faithfulness to him. I've stripped off shame and family custom. To go to the bed of the Dark One, body and mind, Mira wears only the color of God. She's a wild mystic, and I encourage you to read her. I encourage you to hopefully immerse yourself in her poems until your mind no longer tries to grasp and interpret and literalize everything that she's saying, so that why she is saying what she's saying starts to inform you from the inside out. Another important aspect of reading the mystics is to incorporate time to meditate. And time, whether you meditate or you do worship or you do forms of chanting or prayer, but to create space where you let go into the unknown, where you let the mind go. And in order to be able to read the mystics and really absorb them and really feel that sense of inner development, we have to let go of the mind. We have to let go of our lives. We have to create space. We have to kind of root ourselves in this bedrock of consciousness that has no beginning and has no end, where there's a real dissolution of the self. And the more familiar we are with that depth of being and that level of being, then we basically, through that, we create space for something new to occur. And we also create space for where these mystics are coming from to take hold, because spirit is very tenacious, so long as we give it just a little bit of space, because spirit may be taking hold in us and we don't even see it. And then all of a sudden we let go and we meditate. We go, oh my God, what's happened? I didn't realize all this was going on. I had no idea that these openings were happening, this insight was happening, this level of peace or the agitation of positive change was occurring. We have to give space. And it doesn't have to be massive amounts of space. We don't have to dedicate 2 hours every morning before work to do it. But we have to value it. It has to take space in our sense of priorities. And when it takes space in our sense of priorities, even a short period of time, if that's the kind of rhythm we're in, can allow for a touchstone of nourishment that's incredibly valuable. And then there are going to be points in our lives where we're going to really be drawn to experience the cloistered life, to go for 10-day retreats. You can go on contemplative prayer 10-day retreats. The author Sue Monk Kidd regularly goes on 10-day contemplative retreats, and she's churning out New York Times bestsellers and introductions, and she's an unbelievably prolific religious writer. So we may be called to do that, but as we're just allowing ourselves to become introduced to different mystics, or to reintroduce ourselves, or to bring back a little bit of the sacred in a life that might have gotten overcrowded with the realities and pressures of keeping ourselves going financially and socially and and other types of development that we do. So meditate, pray, or allow for these moments of worship, and it will make a difference. And we want to see this approach to the mystics as one thing. Maybe one day we'll read, one day we'll do more meditation, one day we'll do both, and one day we'll do neither, and we're just going to be walking to work, and the light looks incredibly beautiful, even if we're walking down some like cobblestone alley with razor wire on one side, but the light can come through and give us a sense of the living presence of spirit. And we want to mark those moments. We want to give them value. We want to elevate them, because that's what opens up space. We're sort of like digging out space in ourselves for something more sacred and profound to take place, and for the extremity of the Buddha or Mirabai or Krishnamurti. They got to get a toehold in somewhere, and so then they can pry our inner selves open. A few other things that will help us on this path is we want to have an active inquiry, keep a spiritual diary, read these mystics and write down your observations, question, what are they pointing to? What don't I understand? What don't I like? Yeah. I used to listen to Krishnamurti, and he would say, he had this phrase, he always said, "Are you with me?" I'd say, "No." And I'd go, "No, I'm not with you, I'm not with you, I don't understand, I don't understand." That's the kind of thing we want to allow ourselves to experience and value that. Those aren't limitations. To be frustrated at this level of our desire to transform means that we're pushing up against edges of ourselves. And that's where real opening, if we're always comfortable all the time, we won't necessarily be coming up against areas for growth. So we want to see that push and that positive struggle and mark it and note it and just stay with it. Give it a little space. Allow it to be there. Speak about it. Don't try to resolve it, but hold it and value it as part of the transformative process. As we're experiencing the world through their eyes, through the mystic's eyes, and we're developing our appreciation for the courage that they had in their own times and on their own terms, and we start to experience what it would have been to be a Mirabai or a Buddha, to give up that much against those odds in order to realize the level of surrender and oneness and dissolution of the separate self that they did. As we allow ourselves to look at them, we want to cultivate a sense of gratitude. We want to cultivate that awe and reverence and appreciation for those who've come before us, for those who have sung those songs and given those instructions that we're now reading in books, because in their own times and in their own lives they were real pathfinders, and we're benefiting from them. And as part of our own spiritual search, as we develop a sense of gratitude and reverence and thankfulness and awe for those who have worked and given their lives for spiritual realization that we're benefiting from now, we'll also start appreciating and benefiting and becoming compassionate and supportive of ourselves through all of our own difficulties. So we want to experience a sisterhood and brotherhood with these pathfinders, and reverence and awe and a sense of respect, profound respect, because we often don't allow ourselves to experience that kind of generosity of spirit. The need to let go. As much as we want to strive for transformation, and as much as we want to read mystics and have their level of attainment inspire us and pull us, there's a way that if we let go, we become one with them without minimizing attainment. We become one with them so that we're part of the human family, all developing together. And so we're moving shoulder to shoulder. You know, if you think like in those beautiful protest marches in the South, where the religious leaders, you know, were arm in arm, and they had different strengths and different greatnesses, but they were moving the human family forward. And we want to feel that we're moving as a human family forward together with the mystics, so that they're not on a pedestal or a mountaintop so far from us that we feel our lives or our purpose or our calling is too small. And it's one calling to evolve our capacities as human beings, our capacities for love, our capacities for relatedness. And that's what we're really called to do. That's why we do this. And experiencing that level of togetherness is a very powerful support, not just for us, but for our whole culture, towards others, and that kind of gratitude that we would not be where we are now if we weren't standing on the shoulders of those who came before us. As we do this, we're going to feel much closer to the mystics. We're going to feel much less frustrated when we don't understand their English or we don't understand why they did what they did, because we're going to realize that they were also, like us, pushing up against the limitations of what they already know. And as they pushed up against the limitations of what they already know, they were then breaking through to insights and depth and illumination and clarity and real development at the level of consciousness, which is what we want to aspire to as we're on the spiritual path. So I hope that you will also allow the inquiry to penetrate your being in this way and to change not just your levels of understanding, but your ability for relatedness and for unity and for friendship and for comradeship, whether you have a community or congregation or sangha, or whether you're on your own, because we are really creating fields and spaces around us through our mystical practice.